I keep hearing in the news that there's a vaccine that's coming. There's a vaccine that's coming. And every time I hear vaccine, I hear Tuskegee. Radiation experiment. And it's like black people like, okay, it's that meme. I don't think I'm going to be signing up for that. What do you know? What should we be thinking? How should we be processing all of this vaccination madness?
I'll give you vaccination. I'll take Tuskegee.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So I think the number one thing we should take into consideration, vaccines are wonderful. I actually believe in vaccines. If you think about it, your parents were vaccinated, right? And a lot of the childhood diseases that were prevalent around that time, they've been eradicated or controlled to some point because they were vaccinated. Now our generation after us is talking about we want to anti-vax. So that's kind of a disconnect there. Now, there are also a lot of vaccines out there that have been developed over the last 50 years, too, so that may be part of it as well. But I think that one thing that we should all take home is that vaccine does not mean cure, right? Vaccine is not a treatment. It's just a preventive measure to stop the flow of a disease process in the community, pretty much. So vaccine does not mean cure, and vaccine is not a treatment. So everyone's hanging their head on this miracle vaccine that's coming within the next 6 months or the next year. It's not going to cure you of COVID-19. It's just like the flu virus. It'll make your infection less mild. It will hopefully not send you to the hospital when you do get COVID-19 at some point or some other disease that we're talking about now. That's really what we should be thinking about when people talk about vaccines and vaccines. They're fast-tracking vaccines right now because they know that there's going to be a surge at some point, or we're expecting a surge, especially when you add on flu, which is going to start happening in about September, October, that time frame. So now you have two major respiratory or infectious processes coming down the line. One we have a vaccine for, which people still don't like taking, right? And that's why around January, you hear all the news talking about there's a flu epidemic. Every single year there's a flu epidemic around January, February, because that's where it hits the most. That's the highest point. And now we also have COVID-19, and we're still in the first phase, the first throes of it, right? So if the vaccine does come, it's going to be interesting. Let me say that, because still 30% of people say they're not going to take it. They don't trust it.
Well, because
it's
there's
not
history.
even going to be a vaccine. It's going to be a clinical trial.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
So what's a clinical trial, Dr. Yeboah? What does that mean?
So in essence, the clinical trial is testing the safety and the efficacy of a drug, right? It starts off with the conceptualization of people in the science room trying to think about what can we produce to kind of lessen this particular ailment. And it has typically 4 stages. So we keep hearing about they're going to stage 2, they're going to stage 3. And so now the conversation's about the stage 3. Stage 3 is still a trial, right? And so if there's actually 4 stages for a vaccine or a clinical trial to be released at stage 3 means we don't know exactly the safety and the effectiveness of this particular thing that we're producing. And so I think that the important thing to understand about vaccines or clinical trials is that at the end of the day, they're not a cure. In essence, they're still a trial. We're still trying to see what happens. Usually it takes about 12 years for us to really see the causes and effects of something.
Mm-hmm. And so in this environment where we're looking for a kind of like a treatment fast, typically you're supposed to pass each phase before you move on to the next one. Phase 1 complete, phase 2 complete, phase 3 complete, and then it's brought out phase 4 into the public for use. But it just seems to me there's so much. I mean, there are over, 150 trials going on right now, and we're fast-tracking everything. And there's just not enough time. Like, if you're making rice, you don't put the stove on high and then hope that it works out at the end, right? You monitor it and give it some time. You actually let it cook. But if you put it on high, what's going to happen? It's going to burn. And that's really my concern, and that's, I think, the concern for a lot of people.
Well, I'm also thinking because of the history of this nation, we had a radiation experiment. We had sterilization, not just of us, but of Native Americans. I was just watching this TV show, another TV show. So, all right,
we'll never catch up.
You won't. So I won't even tell you. But anyway, they're talking about Native Americans and how if a Native American woman went to get an abortion, she was also sterilized. Yeah. Like it was standard, like you were but that also happened for African descendant people as well. And then, of course, Tuskegee, which was an experiment of drugs. It was an experiment of non-treatment. the problem is we're not even in these clinical trials because we don't trust the government. So how does the vaccine work on us? Because our chemistry, makeup, our DNA is a little, it's, the way drugs interact with our bodies is different, some of us. If we're not in the trials, how will they know what the dosage should be for us?
Absolutely. And as a family, can I just raise my hand like we're in church, please? Can we just stop saying Tuskegee forever? So it's the U.S. Public Health Service Tuskegee syphilis study. It was actually a study that was conducted at Tuskegee University, right? But it wasn't Tuskegee studies. And so every time I hear the word Tuskegee study, my heart cringes because probably about 20 years of my life was dedicated to really going to Tuskegee, Macon County, Alabama, hearing about Herman Shaw, one of the participants of the trial, hearing about the communities. And then we all probably saw Miss Everett's Boys. I don't remember what year that came out, Miss Everett's Boys, that they were dancing boys. So these are hard-working sharecroppers, and they wanted to join a study because Nurse Eunice Rivers said, you know what, we have a study going on, and it's just trying to see about something called bad blood, right? And so, in essence, this Tuskegee study, and I'm glad you mentioned it, it was a study of the untreated syphilitic man, but it already happened in the 1800s, something called the Oslo study. So we already know what happens to your body. But so the whole premise of the Tuskegee syphilis study, or the U.S. Public Health Service Tuskegee syphilis study, was wrong. The Oslo study, which is a 20-year-old study, already told us that if you don't treat syphilis, your eyes are going to go, your heart's going to go, you're going to pass it on to your children. But in 1942, when penicillin came out, they didn't give it to the men who were part of the study. And so for us as a people, I think we need to forever stop saying Tuskegee syphilis study. It was the U.S. Public Health Service study at Tuskegee. And in essence, it's one of those things when you have good intentions, but it goes the wrong way. And I always talk about people that are thirsty a little bit. Not that President Moten at the time, who was the president of Tuskegee, he thought, you know what, we should be a part of this study. You know why? Because we're going to be able to prove finally we got great stuff. We got great physicians at Tuskegee Institute. So he really joined the study with the U.S. Public Health Service because in his heart, he wanted to show that, you know what, our medical schools are fantastic. So that was in his heart, in his research team. But the people that brought the study to Tuskegee, their thought was, you know what, these are not really humans anyway. Let's go ahead and see what happens. Let's listen to the pathophysiology of what happens to them just because we don't think that they're anything anyway. And so this study was published in probably about 43 medical journals. And so for me, one of the reasons I decided to become a public health researcher is I thought the next generation of public health people need to question why. Even if they publish it, question why. Who's the funding source? Who are the people that across the top that said they wrote the study? And so for us as a people, I don't think we need to shun studies, but we need to do what's just that we've been talking about this whole entire evening, which is question. Always question. Where was it done? How many African Americans were in the study? How many Caucasians were in the study? Was it done in an urban environment? Was it done in Africa? Was it done in a place that's similar to where I'm from? And so for us, I think Tuskegee should be symbolic, or the U.S. Public Health Service Tuskegee syphilis study should be symbolic with us asking questions forever.
So how do we know with these clinical trials where those questions, how do we get those questions answered?
Well, in the application for the trial itself, all that information is there. So, for example, when there are trials, let's say I'll give an example of, let's say, orthopedic surgeries for your knees, right? In the journal that comes out, it'll tell you this is a randomized clinical trial that was based at, I'll pick a random name, Michelle Yeboah University. It was also done at Nana College, Karen Hunter University as well. They tell you where it was. The study ran between the years 2010 and 2020. And these are the inclusion criteria. These are the exclusion criteria. These are the people who were allowed into the study and why. And these are the people who were excluded from the study and why. When you read the journal, it's all there. Even the application for the trial, they have to list all these things out because we recognize that there have been abuses in the past, and that's why all these safeguards are in there at this time.
I also say, simply put, when they start talking about the research study on TV, the question should be, does that environment that they conducted the study, does it mirror where I live? Because if it doesn't mirror where I live, then it doesn't represent me. Period, the end. If it was done someplace in England, that's fantastic. But is it going to work in Flushing, New York? And so it has to work in terms of the environment that you live in. If you have a transit environment, if you have an environment with health professionals, if you have an environment with teachers, the environment, and as Yaw just mentioned, randomization, that means there should be a way that they are giving out the study to a random group of people. So it shouldn't just be very prescribed. And so I think that there were three main questions to ask in terms of, is the study representative? One, what's the sample size? How big is the study? Is it 10 people or 10 million people?
Mm-hmm.
Is it 30,000 or 10 people, right? And then the other part is, what was the age of the people who were a part of the study? And often, you have a geriatrician, so was it just young people?
Right.
Was it older people? Were the older people excluded? So what was the age of the population? And then for me, no one will ever say this, but what's the funding source? So if it's a pharmaceutical company and they're running their own trial, I won't say anymore. That's kind of questionable. It's almost like I work at a university and I'm publishing my own study about how great the university is, right? And so that's a little bit questionable. So we have to be able to just kind of have these conversations about what was the setting, what did it look like when they did that study.
And then one more thing you should consider is what's the end point of the study as well. So I'll give you an example. I did a journal club where we're looking at survivability of doing heart surgery in 90-year-olds, right? And so their end point was surviving out of the ICU. So that means that once you leave the ICU, and if you're alive and healthy, you're good. But what if you die on the medicine floor? What if you don't make it out of the hospital? What if you don't make it past the first week after your surgery? It doesn't count because my stated endpoint was leaving the ICU. So again, when you read trials, these are kind of all the critical thinking type questions you have to ask as you're going through. And it doesn't really make a lot of sense for the survivability of a 90-year-old getting surgery for the heart to be leaving the ICU. What kind of quality of life are they going to have afterwards? So those are the type of things we have to, as you're reading, you have to, when we teach our students, you're not reading a story. You're reading to critically appraise and critically think about the information that you're receiving at all times.
Doctors, this is, one, really helpful because I feel somewhat less frantic about the idea of a vaccine. But one of the things that I'm thinking about, just as it pertains to the pandemic generally, there was an article in Bloomberg that talked about the fact that we're sort of in COVID might be the first major pandemic, the first, right? Emphasis on the first, meaning that there are more to come. And they were talking about, we've got COVID and we had SARS and we've got Ebola breakouts that are far more frequent than they used to be. And they sort of talked about we need to consider the fact that this isn't just a pandemic, but really the beginning of an era of pandemic, which they tied to deforestation, which they tied to environmental disruption. So, climate change and pandemic reality, the fact that there are gases being released from ice that has been trapped for thousands of years, that is infecting bugs who then bite us. And so all of these things are sort of coalescing in a way. How should we be thinking about dealing with the pandemic as a long-term partner? If this vaccine doesn't come in January, if it's not our after Kwanzaa surprise that, everyone seems to be hoping it's going to be, if it's really here for the long term, how do we prepare to coexist with an era of pandemics, particularly because we don't have the type of vaccine infrastructure in place that would allow us to defeat them, but they really are something that we end up just coexisting with? How do we address that?
So the main way to address that, and a lot of people don't like to hear this, is you need to have some kind of lifestyle change. You need to stay healthy at all times. You need to stop drinking, stop smoking. You need to exercise. You need to drink plenty of water. I'm serious, because you can't control what's out there. The only thing you can control is yourself. The healthier you are, the more robust your immune system, the more likely you'll be able to fight off everything that comes along the way. Larry's talking about, there was an article talking about how the tundra is melting, right, and releasing all this carbon that's in the ground, and also releasing all these pathogens into the air also. We've never seen these before. You can't control for that. So the only thing you can control is yourself. If there's no vaccine, there's no treatment, but you're not healthy, guess who's going to succumb first? It's going to be you. But as long as you make sure that you are healthy and robust, and your immune system is well functioning, you have a fighting chance. But if you're not healthy, you may not have such a strong fighting chance.
But I also think we have to advance the way that we question, right? So back in the day, the pyramid guide, wearing seatbelts, all these preventative things that were out there, they were just like, oh, okay. But now we're kind of used to organic. We're used to kind of reading the back of labels. We need to get used to science, right? We need to get used to questioning, like, well, who wrote that study? Well, where did they come from? Well, how many people were in that study? Where did it take place? And so that needs to be the new way that we kind of acclimate ourselves to things. I remember back in the day when I would read Ebony and Essence, they used to have a little section on research on kind of what's going on, and they used to break it down. So I think for us as a community, this needs to be a part of our daily kind of conversation. Did you hear about that study? Yeah, what would they say about it? And then figure, learn how to question it. And not that we already know how to question things, but learn how to question it like the scientists and have them respond back. We don't have to have all the answers, but we can ask the questions.
866-801-8255. Will you take the vaccine? If offered, will you take it? Will you be part of a clinical trial? I'm curious if any of our listeners would be part of a clinical trial right now.